This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one solution for anyone looking to create a website or online store. The Sony PlayStation 2. What more needs to be said? It's only the best-selling console ever made. Gran Turismo, Shadow of the Colossus, Final Fantasy, Kingdom Hearts, God of War, Katamari Damacy, Ratchet & Clank, Tekken, and those are just the exclusives. If we include multi-platform games, we have iconic series like Resident Evil, Grand Theft Auto, the good versions, Burnout, Midnight Club, Simpsons Hit and Run, Metal Gear Solid, Silent Hill, Crash Bandicoot. We could go on and on. Sure, the PS2 was graphically inferior to the GameCube, Xbox, and some argue even the Dreamcast, but there's no denying that you had an incredible selection of games at your disposal on the PS2. And now that the PS2 has surpassed over 20 years of age, it's only going to get more nostalgic and more collectible. Emulators like PCSX2 are good and are constantly improving, but they're still not perfect, and most importantly, they're not quite the same. So in my opinion, there's no time like the present to either get your hands on one or start taking advantage of the one you already have. And what do you do when you retrieve your PS2 from the back of your closet or a nice old lady on Craigslist? Well, there's a lot more you can do than just pop discs in and play them. So today, we're going to cover how you can get the most out of your PS2 in this day and age. Now first, let's get the obvious out of the way. There are two major hardware revisions of the PS2. The original, usually cruelly referred to as the Fat PS2, and the later Slim model released in about late 2004. If you're looking to pick up a new PS2, then I highly recommend you get the original Fat version. They're a little less common on the second-hand market today, but they have several advantages over the Slim model that I'll mention throughout the video. The first and main advantage of a Fat PS2 is this, the expansion bay, which with a PS2 network adapter or third-party Chinese clone, can attach a full-size PC hard drive that sits comfortably inside the bay. While Sony originally intended this to be used only with proprietary drives for just a handful of games and applications, modders quickly figured out how to use any generic hard drive and load games directly from it. Originally with a homebrew app called HD Loader, complete with this very cheesy commercial.
To order, visit www.hdloader.org.
Triple W? More recently, the venerable Open PS2 Loader has become the tool of choice. This is honestly reason enough to mod a Fat PS2. What could be more convenient than having all the games you want to play ready at the press of a button? This also means if you're picking up a new one and really want to save money, you can get a Fat PS2 with a broken DVD drive. Most people will consider it useless, bringing down the price, but with a mod and a hard drive, you'll never need the DVD drive anyway. Even if you want to rip real PS2 games that you own onto the hard drive, that can be done with any conventional PC. The Slim PS2 removed the expansion bay since it was very rarely used for any legitimate purposes anyway. There are alternatives to a hard drive for loading games on a Slim PS2, but nothing quite as good. Early models of the Slim PS2 still have the hard drive bus on the board, just no available socket requiring you to solder one in manually. It can be done, but it is extremely cumbersome. There are no less than 40 wires you need to solder, making it even more complicated than the infamous 20-wire PS2 mod chips. It's also possible to boot games from an external USB hard drive, but you don't really want to. The PS2 only ever had USB 1.1 with a maximum throughput of 12 megabits per second. This is significantly slower than the DVD drive, so expect games to load slowly and cutscenes to skip and stutter as the USB struggles to keep up. You can also do network storage. At 100 megabits per second, the PS2's Ethernet is way faster than its USB. This does require you to have some kind of networkable file storage, but that could be anything from a computer or NAS on your network, or potentially even a Raspberry Pi with a microSD card in it. Finally, there are also methods to boot burned disks, either with a mod chip or without. I'll get into these a little later in the video, and while burning disks may seem a little cumbersome in the days of hard drive booting and ODEs, on a Slim PS2 it probably is still the most straightforward way to play backups. You know, as long as you don't mind burning disks and the inevitable wear and tear on the drive. As you can see, while some of these options are better than others, none of them are quite as convenient as just having the expansion bay with a hard drive ready to go. We will continue covering Slim PS2s in this video, but yeah, that's why I recommend getting a Fat PS2 if you can. Now before we get too deep into it, let me take a moment to thank the sponsor of this video, Squarespace. If you're like me, you've spent a lot of time writing HTML, and CSS, and JavaScript, and a server-side language like PHP, and probably SQL too to top it all off. And after learning all of those languages, putting days or even weeks into writing a website, ensuring it works on mobile, and keeping up with design trends so no one makes fun of it being dated, I usually end up with something no better than what I could have made on Squarespace, despite being much more work to create, maintain, and manage content for. Squarespace has hundreds of professional-looking templates ready to go, and all the WYSIWYG tools you could ever hope for to make them your own. In pretty much just a few clicks, you're ready to start publishing whatever content you want, whether it's a blog, secure online store, or just general information about something like PS2 modding. So if you're looking to make a website and you value your time, I highly recommend checking out squarespace.com where you can test all of their features with a free trial. Then when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/MattKC to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. And now back to the PS2. So the first thing you'll most likely want to do to get started with modding your PS2 is install a hack for the main menu called FreeMcBoot, or FreeMCBoot if you prefer, or the hard drive alternative known as FreeHDBoot. They're both pretty much the same thing, so it's up to you which one works best for your setup. One is installed on memory cards and the other is installed on hard drives, again if you have a fat PS2 that supports them. FreeHDBoot is actually extremely easy to install. Just plug the hard drive you're planning to use into your PC, either internally or with a USB adapter, and use the tools that come with the FHDB newbie package to write the FHDB image to it and fill out the rest of the partition table. That's pretty much it. Once the hard drive is plugged into your PS2, it'll be all modded and ready to go. FreeMcBoot is a little more work, but will be your only option if you don't have a hard drive. Thankfully, it's a lot easier than it used to be due to an exploit discovered in 2020 called FreeDVDBoot. Let's talk about the PS2 security for a second. The PS2 contains a chip called the Mechacon, which sits between the disk drive and the rest of the system. It's the almighty gatekeeper, ensuring the system has no access to a disk that isn't deemed authentic. However, PS2 aficionados will know that Sony heavily marketed the PS2 as a DVD player that also played games. And one of the selling points of DVDs was users being able to make their own, to burn home movies and school concerts and whatnot. So, to appease those people, there is one kind of burned DVD that the Mechacon will accept, and that's a burned DVD video. FreeDVDBoot lets you bypass the Mechacon by making a disc appear to be a DVD video. The Mechacon will accept it, and the PS2 will load its built-in DVD player, which will promptly crash due to the intentionally corrupt data on the disc, allowing the disc to take control of execution and do whatever it wants, such as load Tetris or the FMCB installer. Technically, you could use FreeDVDBoot as a homebrew or game launcher on its own, but since it's relatively inconvenient, I'll assume you went ahead and used it to install FMCB. By the way, as I'm sure you can tell, I'm really just giving an overview in this video. There are other ways to get FMCB installed, this is just the one that I think is the best, but I'll leave a link in the description for the great PS2 all-in-one guide, which goes into much more detail about all the methods available and the steps required to perform them. Anyways, once FMCB is installed, you're ready to start using it and launching Homebrew. But I should mention that FMCB is primarily just that, a homebrew loader. While homebrew apps like OpenPS2 Loader can load games from alternative sources like hard drives, USB and Ethernet, the aforementioned Mechacon chip has remained untouched. This means that while a PS2 with FMCB is technically modded, it still can't boot backup disks of any kind without a little bit more help. But more on that later. For now, let's cover playing games off a hard drive, USB, or network. With a file manager called LaunchElf, which comes as standard with any FMCB installation, you can copy homebrew apps from a USB flash drive to your memory card or hard drive. And the first homebrew app you'll probably want is OpenPS2 Loader. Put it on a USB, copy it over, add it to the main FMCB menu if you want, and then you're ready to start playing ISOs, which can be transferred with HDL server if your network adapter has a network adapter, a lot of Chinese clones only do the hard drive, or by plugging the hard drive back into your computer where you can load ISOs onto it with various tools such as WinHeap. For USB or Ethernet, OPL makes these fairly straightforward too, as long as you're fine with the drawbacks of using either of these that I mentioned earlier. OPL works really well and has a lot of cool additional features such as PadMU, which lets you play games with PS3 and PS4 controllers via USB or Bluetooth. I kind of prefer doing this actually because it means not having to deal with the DualShock 2's pressure-sensitive buttons, which always hurt my thumbs, especially when playing driving games. Even the shoulder buttons and D-pad are pressure-sensitive, which is borderline psychotic. It also lets you set tweaks and cheats, upscale the video output with GSM, and even use virtual memory cards that can be stored on the hard drive. In my opinion, FMCB and OPL are a must-have for any PS2, at least if it can support an internal hard drive. But if you're someone who can't load ISOs or just wants to burn disks instead, OPL isn't for you, but you do have some options. Historically, you had a homebrew app called ESR, which was a precursor to the FreeDVDBoot exploit I mentioned earlier. It too required patching ISOs to look like DVD video disks so the Mechacon would allow access to them. But rather than hijacking the DVD player software itself, it required a separate loader to be launched from FMCB to load the game from the second track. To make this more convenient, FMCB did have a feature to load ESR automatically when such disks were inserted. ESR is still in use today, however, it does have some drawbacks. Patching can be a little inconvenient. Back in the day, I would frequently forget to patch before burning and would end up wasting a disc in the process. Also, some PS2 games came on CDs rather than DVDs, and they can't be patched out of the box because, naturally, you can't patch a CD to be a DVD video. There are ways to manually convert from a CD game to a DVD game, but for some games this is difficult and just adds to the inconvenience. But unless you want to install a mod chip, ESR remains one of the most popular and convenient ways to play burned discs on the PS2. But speaking of the mod chip, Let's talk about that. I've refrained from saying a lot about it so far because it's infamously one of the more complex mod chips to install. On a slim PS2, it's 20 wires of fun that need to be soldered onto some tiny service mount points on the PS2 motherboard. For experienced solderers, it is doable. In fact, I have managed to do a few myself, but in no way is this mod for beginners. You could easily screw up your PS2 if you're not careful. Also, nowadays most people will say there's no point to mod chipping when OPL and FMCB exist. However, there are two reasons you might want to consider mod chipping over just soft modding. Firstly, if you are stuck burning disks to play backups, like if you have a PS2 Slim and don't want to deal with USB or Ethernet, the mod chip means you don't have to worry about patching the ISOs before burning. You can simply just burn and you're all set to go. But secondly, and this has been the reason I would often install a mod chip, it allows booting PS1 games. Now, this isn't something that everyone is going to care about, but I like PS1 games and I like the convenience of playing them on the PS2. With real PS1 hardware on the board, the backwards compatibility is about as good as it can get. It's the same reason those early PS3 models are valuable nowadays. Real PS2 hardware inside them leading to extremely good backwards compatibility. The PS2 even has some advantages over a regular PS1 since it provides an option for speeding up the disk speed. This means loading times can be drastically reduced, which makes the PS2 the preferred choice for speedrunners of PS1 games. But I should note that while I'm touting accuracy, there were later PS2s that replaced the PS1 CPU with a PowerPC chip that emulated it. This did reduce compatibility a little bit, but hey, that's just another reason to get a fat PS2 since all of those will have the real thing. So if I like playing PS1 games on the PS2 and it even has real practical advantages, you might be wondering why I haven't mentioned it so far. It's because PS1 backups and homebrew have never actually been possible with only soft modding. Mod chips will get you there, and I've heard you can get away with only soldering 4 of the 20 mod chip wires for PS1 games if that's all you care about, but otherwise there's historically been no way to leverage that native PS1 support with just a soft mod. Now, before you jump down my throat, there are software emulators, including an official Sony developed one called Pops, which was intended to play exactly one game for a Japanese DLC release. And while the community has made strides in writing performance and compatibility patches to get more games to play, ultimately the PS2 CPU on its own just lacks the power for a highly accurate and compatible PS1 emulator. So why can't the soft mods leverage the PS2's native PS1 support? Well, it's actually not their fault, it's due to a limitation in the way the PS2 is designed. Sony realized that if the PS2's PS1 CPU really did nothing but play PS1 games, most of the time it would go completely unused. So they gave it another role, handling all of the new PS2 I/O. So even when you're not playing PS1 games, the PS1 CPU is hard at work handling stuff like USB, FireWire, the expansion bay, and Magic Gate decryption. And when a PS1 game is loaded and it drops those responsibilities to start playing games, it all works out because no PS1 game uses any of that stuff. But it doesn't work out for us trying to play backups because those I/O ports are how we get something like OPL to play backups without having to deal with the Mechacon. By design, the PS2 literally can't do both PS1 games and handle those I/O ports at the same time. And forget about ESR because the PS2 definitely won't boot a PS1 game from a DVD, let alone a mutant hybrid DVD video. So, without being able to hack the Mechacon from software, a mod chip is our only choice. Or at least, it used to be. Mechapone, released in April of 2021, is the first homebrew tool to exploit security flaws in the Mechacon and ultimately reconfigure it to behave in different ways. With Mechapone, you can set the Mechacon to basically any region of retail PS2, but crucially, you can also set it to behave like a development console, as in the kind of console that will accept burned disks under the assumption that a developer will be testing pre-release code with them. Now, it's not exactly that simple. Sony knew that they shouldn't just be distributing consoles that you can pirate games on, so ISOs do have to be flagged as master disks, which just means they're a burned development disk. That'll get them past the Mechacon, but the PS2 will still be suspicious, meaning you'll need to launch the game manually with either FMCB or Launch Elf. Yes, in practice, this is ultimately not much different to needing a patcher and launcher like ESR, but there is actually a lot more going on here. For example, this mod straight up disables all region checks, so if you like importing games, you can just play them as is with this. Secondly, Mechapone does have a setting called Force Unlock, which makes the Mechacon identify all disks as PS2 master disks. This means you can skip the patching step, but does mean other types of disks like PS1 games and DVD videos won't work. But PS2 CDs will, which is already an improvement over ESR. There's also apparently theoretically a patch that could be made in the future to bypass the need to manually launch games too, so we may be on the verge of Mechapone or something like it eclipsing not only ESR but also the mod chip as far as being able to just play imports and backups. This could be big news, especially for slim PS2 users who don't want a mod chip, use slow USB, or maintain some kind of networked storage. But what does this have to do with PS1 games? Well, if you know anything about the PS1 copy protection, you know that it and the region lock were kind of all rolled into one. So by disabling one, we've effectively disabled the other two. That's right, PS1 backups just boot now, meaning you don't even need those 4 wires on the mod chip. And given the hardware limitations I mentioned earlier, I think this is really the best we can hope for as far as PS1 backups on the PS2. There are of course real ODEs on the PS1 that will let you boot PS1 ISOs from an SD card. If you have a PS1 and can afford them, you may still prefer those for their convenience, but I doubt we'll see a PS2 ODE of any kind since OPL already fits the bill in most cases. It's really just the PS1 games, which even I'll admit is kind of a niche use case. But yeah, even now, exciting stuff is still happening in the world of PS2 modding. All I can say is I applaud the work being done and I'm excited to see what happens next. As far as other homebrew goes, there are of course the sorts of things that you'd expect, like emulators and media players. The usual suspects are here, like Atari 2600, NES, Genesis, and Super Nintendo. Obviously, someone has ported Doom and Super Mario 64 to it, but if we're being perfectly honest, homebrew isn't where the PS2 shines, at least compared to its contemporary, the original Xbox. I think this is mainly due to it being a lot harder to hack in its prime than the Xbox. I mean, most of the easy non-mod chip stuff we've talked about came out well after the PS3 had already succeeded it. Not to mention the Xbox's PC-like architecture was also really familiar and made it easy to write for and port things to. So if you're looking for a homebrew or emulation beast from this generation, get yourself an OG Xbox instead. Anyways, that is, in my opinion, everything you can do to get the best out of your PS2 this year. I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you're inspired to play some great classic games. As always, thank you so much for watching and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye guys.
Subscribe to Mac KC.